Charlotte Emily is a name that most FNAF fans know and at least know a good bit about her character, but the information around her is so messy and speculative that it often gets confusing to actually talk about who Charlotte Emily is. And for those less in the know, the marionette is an even bigger enigma. So I thought another Rye lists all the direct lore and relevant speculation about a character and then shows a mini timeline about them video would be fitting here. Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. To go chronologically by game for the lore here would be admittedly so confusing that it would be unhelpful. So let's start with how we know this character even exists, and then we'll go game by game. In FNAF 6, the main ending of the game has a very downtrodden man give us a monologue as to why he set up all of FNAF 6. And in the monologue, he says this:
"My daughter, if you can hear me, I knew you would return as well."
In essence, this is telling us that the guy who set up FNAF 6 has a daughter who was killed by William Afton, who goes on to possess the marionette and then help the other spirits of the MCI. I just went over this in the Henry video, but plenty of the evidence here points to that man giving the monologue being Henry Emily from the Silver Eyes, the co-owner of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. In the books, he had a daughter named Charlotte who was killed by William Afton. Now, in the books, he then recreates her as a robot and it's this whole messy thing, but the important thing to know is that likely the "my daughter" referenced here is Charlotte Emily, and in the game's continuity, she possesses the marionette. And according to this monologue, she, as the marionette, is the thing that helped allow the MCI victims to possess the animatronic suits. So with that information in mind, that this child is Charlotte Emily who's possessing the marionette, where does this character crop up outside of the FNAF 6 monologue? A majority of information about Charlotte comes from FNAF 2. Most of the death minigames center or at least feature Charlotte Emily before and after her death. Give Gifts, Give Life is essentially the game showing us that as the marionette, she assisted the missing child incident victims in possessing their animatronic suits. Now, some people take this minigame as her literally shoving the bodies into the suits, but I don't think that makes much sense. I think it's much more likely that we're going off of the logic of Alone Together. In that Tales in the Pizzaplex book, it's explained that when somebody dies and their body remains unfound, that spirit might not have their own memories. They might not even realize they're dead. It takes that spirit finding their own body to know. And in many iterations of the MCI, the spirits are not aware that they're dead. They're simply playing at Freddy's, unaware that anything's happened. So I think the most likely real-life version of what this minigame is saying is that Charlotte, as the marionette, someone whose body was left out in an alleyway, which we'll get to, has her memories. And when those spirits show up and don't have theirs, she helps them find their bodies, get their memories back, and allow them to then possess the animatronics. In Save Them, we see the marionette leading Withered Freddy to try and stop William Afton from doing what he's doing. This has a lot of implications, but it seems like Charlotte is actively working against William Afton. And most notably, in Take Cake to the Children, we see Charlotte Emily outside of a Freddy's or Fazbear restaurant, William Afton roll up in a car, kill her, and drive away. Now, this minigame does spark an intense debate. What restaurant is this? Some people argue it's Fredbear's. After all, the layout is very basic and we only see this bear-like animatronic, which could be Freddy or Fredbear. It's hard to tell with these graphics. Other people try to use the timeline to argue that it's Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Admittedly, there's not much evidence for either side, at least not yet. Before we move on from FNAF 2, I should mention that she also pops up here in these between night cutscenes, but like just the one time, and it's really confusing, not super helpful. Notably, that is the FNAF 1 Freddy's though. So like, is this the original Freddy's location, or was the marionette at the FNAF 1 Freddy's? That's another debate. In FNAF 3, while less direct, we do get mentions of the marionette throughout the Happiest Day minigames. Depending on what Happiest Day minigame you're playing as a different animatronic. However, in the main Happiest Day minigame, we're playing as a spirit wearing the puppet mask. And I think it's not too far of a stretch to assume that anything we're playing in the Happiest Day minigames is that spirit, aka Charlotte Emily is the one trying to create the happiest day for the crying child. There's also this rare Easter egg where the marionette can appear in one of the FNAF 3 hallways, notably with a reflection, so some people use this to argue that the marionette was lurking at that location, likely looking for William Afton. Now, there's not really any mentions of Charlotte Emily or the marionette in FNAF 4 or Sister Location. But that does bring us back to 6, where the monologue is not the only time she's brought up, because of the security puppet minigame. If you play enough, you can get this Easter egg, where one girl is locked outside and bullies have prevented the marionette from going to fetch her. Eventually the marionette breaks out, but by that time she's left the window. It hunts her down, but when it gets to her, it's too late, and the little girl is dead in the alleyway, the heavy rain shutting down the marionette as it collapses on top of her. It's heavily implied that this is when Charlotte Emily possesses the marionette. After all, she died and then had an animatronic essentially die on top of her. So yeah, that tracks. Moving on to FNAF World, this is definitely more speculative, but there's no real good other place to put it. Because the thing is, there's no real direct mentions of Charlotte Emily or the marionette in FNAF World. But there's a lot of references to the Happiest Day minigames in FNAF World. In fact, Doing the Clock Ending is essentially recreating Happiest Day from FNAF 3, but in FNAF World. And if the Happiest Day is something that was likely done by Charlotte Emily, then can we extend that logic to the entirety of FNAF World? That FNAF World is something created by Charlotte Emily. I think it's possible when using evidence we find in Ultimate Custom Night. There's a decent amount of evidence linking FNAF World and Ultimate Custom Night. Not only are they both weird side games in the FNAF franchise, but some of their Easter eggs connect. Notably, if you don't have the achievement for the drowning ending in FNAF World, the one where you find Old Man Consequences and drown in his lake, but then in Ultimate Custom Night, you get the Old Man Consequences Easter egg and drown in his lake, the achievement triggers in FNAF World. These games are connected. And if they are, and if they're happening at the same time, then some of the marionette death lines are very interesting. First of all, we have,
"The others are like animals, but I am very aware."
Which honestly isn't super relevant to the point I'm about to make, but it does lean into the idea that the FNAF 2 movie presents, one that the marionette can remotely control any of the FNAF 2 animatronics. But that's not what's important right now. What's important is the line,
"I don't hate you, but you need to stay out of my way."
This line is incredibly interesting. As far as we're aware, everything in Ultimate Custom Night is created by one specific person to haunt and torture William Afton for the rest of time. But here comes Charlotte Emily as the mimic, essentially telling William, "I'm not here to torture you. I don't care about you, but you are impeding what I am trying to do." What are you trying to do, Charlotte? Well, if FNAF World and Ultimate Custom Night are taking place at the same time, it could be Charlotte's thinking that some of the spirits are not able to move on so long as William Afton is still alive. In other words, she's moved on from hating William Afton. She just needs him to stop existing so the other spirits can find peace. Now, like a lot of older Five Nights at Freddy's characters, her story seems to end with the FNAF 6 fires. After all, there's really no mention of Charlotte Emily or the puppet in Help Wanted moving forward. Now, there are Nightmare-Ione plushes throughout Security Breach, Help Wanted 2, Ruin, etc., but Nightmare-Ione is a loose connection. It's a Halloween variant of the marionette, and it's the Nightmare-Ione plushies that are all over. Interpretation of these is strange at best. I personally believe it's a representation of the VR games, but that's also speculative. Frankly, it's really weird and it doesn't super fit in anywhere, so for now, it's being left out. We already ran over a good amount of speculation in the lore part of this video, because you kind of have to with Charlotte Emily. But there are some books that provide additional information that we don't get from the games directly, and looser evidence that I think is useful to bring in. But it's not in the Silver Eyes. In fact, I'm going to bring up a book you're probably not even thinking of, Five Nights at Freddy's Ticket to Fun, because this isn't a book. It's a glorified toy box, but inside of it is a mini brochure for a lot of different things that happened at Fazbear locations. But the important thing to bring up for today's video is this page on party wristbands, which reads, "Along with food, games, and entertainment, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza also hosts birthday parties. All parties are catered by our Freddy Fazbear's Pizza kitchen, and goodie bags and balloons are complimentary. Additionally, all children attending parties at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza are provided with wristbands as a souvenir of their time at our establishment and to easily track party attendees." Now, I mentioned earlier in the video that there is a debate on whether or not Charlotte Emily died at Fredbear's Family Diner or Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. But if you remember in the security puppet minigame, the marionette is able to find Charlotte Emily because she was wearing that security wristband. The party wristband that's mentioned in this brochure as being a part of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, not Fredbear's Family Diner. To make it even more severe, this page has a UV lining. And if you take a black light to it, it shows the sprite from Security Puppet, the sprite of Charlotte being locked outside. This is damn near confirmation from an activity toy box that Charlotte Emily died in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, not Fredbear's Family Diner. This is why we stress out about lore in any location. This is why we looked at the coloring book for lore. You never know with this franchise. Now, this is very important to the timeline because since it's guaranteed to have taken place in a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, she could not have been killed before 1983. Now, I would personally argue that this means she must have died after the crying child was bit, which then gives William motivation to kill her, but there's no hard evidence for that. So, with all of this evidence in mind, who is Charlotte Emily? And what is the timeline surrounding her character? Charlotte Emily was the only daughter of Henry Emily, co-owner of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a perfectly normal child who was just a victim of circumstance and her father's overly trusting nature. Unaware as to what was being brewed in the mind of William Afton, one day some bullies locked Charlotte Emily outside of a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and it was that fateful day that an angry William Afton was coming to pay a visit. Seeing the opportunity, he killed Charlotte Emily in the alleyway and drove off. But the marionette still tried to chase her down due to her security bracelet, and due to the heavy rain, was malfunctioning along the way, eventually collapsing on top of her, as the two lay there, freshly dead, together. And it was in that moment that Charlotte Emily's spirit goes on to possess the marionette. But she remembers what happened. She remembered that William killed her, and she couldn't rest until he was finally brought to justice. So for some time, she remained, looking for an opportunity to catch William Afton in the act, to show her father the kind of man William Afton truly was. But after some time, some new spirits entered the pizzeria. Spirits that remained there but didn't know that they were dead. 5 children happily playing together in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Surely something was wrong, and Charlotte Emily had to help them find out the truth. She showed them each of their own bodies, stuffed into the animatronics. And when she did that, one by one, their memories returned to them. And it was in that moment that they would have been able to find peace and rest, but they had other plans as well. William Afton was still off being dangerous. They couldn't let him get away with this. However, William Afton proved more cunning than they were aware of. At the FNAF 2 location, she tried to cut him off with Withered Freddy, but he either outsmarted or overpowered them, and they failed. They tried to attack men that looked like him, but they were either wrong or unable to finish the job. It wasn't until one day that his greed became so great that it became his undoing. Keeping them trapped in the suits wasn't enough. He needed more material. So he went to the FNAF 1 location after it had closed and began to take apart the animatronics piece by piece, night after night. But all this did was allow those spirits to roam freely throughout the pizzeria. And it was on that last night, when he came back for just a little bit more material, that the spirits of those animatronics attacked. They cornered him in a back room, and in a panic, he put on the Spring Bonnie suit and died. But again, Charlotte remained. According to the character encyclopedia, she had a way to sense that he was still around, and she waited to make sure he'd stay down. Until one day, when she was tricked by an animatronic bear. One built by her very own father. One built with the express purpose to lure the marionette, encapsulate it inside of it, fuse itself to it, transport it to the FNAF 6 location, and extract Charlotte Emily inside. In other words, the marionette was captured by Lefty, and Charlotte Emily was brought to the FNAF 6 location just before the fire. And like the rest of the company in the building, they were all burned away and began to find peace. But Charlotte Emily realized that several of the spirits were still stuck and unable to rest. And it's there and then that she began using the memories of the victims in the fire to help them achieve rest, creating FNAF World, helping spirits like the crying child finally rest after all these years. And that's Charlotte Emily. Henry Emily is another entry into the long list of absolutely indispensable characters of the Five Nights at Freddy's timeline that we have barely any information about. But instead of a victim, Henry is the co-owner of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And again, he's barely referenced in the entirety of the games. Yeah, we're gonna be scrounging at the bottom of the barrel for evidence today. But it's Five Nights at Freddy's, so I'm sure you're used to it. Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. So we'll start with the game lore about Henry Emily, which is admittedly incredibly sparse. The first confirmed reference to Henry Emily is in Secret of the Mimic, the most recent video game. And technically that's just to Hen. We're 99% certain about another time Henry shows up in the timeline, but that is not directly confirmed. So for now, all we have is Secret of the Mimic in this audio log addressed to Henry.
Test. Journal entry. I got the change order from Hen last night. None of this makes sense. I'm almost done. Why change it now? It would be so much easier to keep using the spring locks. Just hire some teens to wear the suits like we always do.
That's it. This is, again, literally, and by no stretch of the imagination, unless I'm forgetting something, the only time in the entire Five Nights at Freddy's franchise that Henry Emily is directly addressed in the games. You're kidding me. So how do we know what Henry is then? Well, there are other times in the franchise he's referenced, but we need information about him to know when he's being referenced. So where do we get that information? Well, we have to get a little creative with some of the less confirmed or less directly adjacent pieces of media from Five Nights at Freddy's, mainly the books. So
let's get creative!
The books are actually where we start learning more about Henry Emily, because he's like an actual character in them. Well, he exists in backstories. Damn, even in the best of times, he's a background character. The main character of the novel trilogy is Charlotte Emily, who, over the course of the 3 books, we learn is actually a robot. See, in the separate continuity for the FNAF novels, Henry Emily and William Afton were business partners that opened up Fredbear's Family Diner together, and then later Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Henry was an excellent inventor, and it was his genius that allowed for the creation of these animatronics and the Springlock suits. In that continuity, however, William Afton kills his daughter, Charlotte Emily, and his grief sends him into a manic spiral, to the point where instead of going to therapy and processing this, he creates a robotic replica of Charlotte Emily and programs her to act like Charlotte never died. He then begins to make 3 more copies of different ages so she can grow up throughout the time, and uses this weird hallucinogenic technology to make her seem lifelike. He has lost his mind. Remember, keep in mind, and I'm never gonna get over this, his son's alive. In the book, he has 2 kids, and the son survived. His sister reminds him like, hey, you have a living son and wife still. Pay attention to them. And he is so locked in that not only does he focus all of his time on recreating his daughter, he programs her to think her brother died so her memories make sense. Her living brother. I can't get into it right now. Now, it's a wild story, and to be clear, it's different from the games. There's several things in the FNAF novel trilogy that do not line up with the game timeline that makes it a necessity that these are 2 separate stories. William dies way later in the timeline in a very different way. He seemingly only has Elizabeth as a daughter and no sons, etc., etc. But the thing is, even though these are 2 separate stories, they are related. They're echoes of each other. They may not be the same song, but they rhyme. After all, the same goes for the movies. That's a completely separate story. But William and Henry are still co-owners of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. They still work together to make that happen. William Afton is still the guy who kills people. There are echoes in these stories. So if we're to assume that in the games, a man named Henry Emily co-owned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza with William Afton, does that help us find any lore from the games and attach it to the game version of Henry? Well, it does, the one that most people know him for. Now we can talk about FNAF 6, or Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator. Which, by the way, it's still insane to me that the first piece of even speculative evidence that Henry Emily exists at all as a character is in the last main series game that Scott created. Huh? Anyway, throughout FNAF 6, it's clear that we're working for somebody. The man who set up all of this. He's the same man who leaves us the cassette tapes we use during the salvage minigames and whose monologues we hear at the end of the games. But those 2 monologues are the key times that we get any information about him. The first one plays if you've salvaged every animatronic and survived all the way to the end, where you get the FNAF monologue, like the thing people know, one of the best moments in the entire franchise, the one that goes,
Connection terminated.
in this monologue, the voice tells us that he knows pretty much everything you could about what's happened at the Fazbear franchises. He knows Elizabeth by name and addresses Circus Baby as Elizabeth. So not only does he know her, but he knows that she's possessing Circus Baby. He calls William an old friend, sarcastically but still, and he claims that his daughter was killed by William Afton and possesses the marionette. So whoever this voice is incredibly entrenched into this series, to the point that he also knows Michael Afton. After all, he says that this job listing was not intended for the player character, who is likely Michael Afton, but says that even though a way out was planned for them, he has a feeling that's not what he wants and this is right where he wants to be, implying that he knows it's a similarly mournful, regretful person involved in this whole mess. And all of that already has connections to Henry Emily. But there's one more damning monologue if you go for the insanity ending, where you get Henry's inner thoughts in the lead up to creating FNAF 6. Not only are there way more regrets through it, but he mentions that the MCI victims are, quote, little souls trapped in prisons of my making. Well, we know that the MCI victims are possessing the original Freddy Fazbear animatronics. So if that's where they're trapped, this quote is saying that whoever this voice is the one who created the Freddy animatronics. Altogether, this game is telling us that FNAF 6, the pizzeria simulator, was created by a man who knows everything about Fazbear's, knows William Afton, knows about Elizabeth and Michael Afton, his daughter was killed by William Afton, and he made the animatronics for the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location. That's just gotta be Henry Emily. And from there, we now know that Charlotte is the one who possesses the marionette in the games. So that's a lot of information about him. We basically learned that much of his backstory is the same, even if the plot of these games are different than the books. But is there any other reference to Henry throughout the series? Well, not really. A lot of people say that this desk man from FNAF World might be Henry Emily with the way he talks, but frankly, I think he's more likely a self-insert of Scott Cawthon than anything else, especially since Circus Baby kills him, which doesn't line up with the timeline at all. Technically speaking, there really isn't another mention of Henry throughout the entire games, but I do think we have reason to believe that there is speculative evidence of Henry somewhere else in this franchise, which is once again in Secret of the Mimic. An undercurrent of the story of Secret of the Mimic is that William Afton was slowly corroding MCM from the inside to topple it and buy it for himself. He was messing with contracts, extending things to waste time and money, and one of the biggest parts of this plan was to poach employees, approaching these unhappy MCM workers and saying, hey, here's a better job for a similar thing you're already doing for more pay. Come work for me instead. Slowly and steadily eating the business right out from Edwin's nose. But to do this, he would have needed help from somebody on the inside. In one of the admin offices, we find this email. We are almost there. I need the rest of the Murray staff contact info. The sooner the better. You get that for me and I can sweeten the deal. How would you like to manage one of the new franchise locations? W.A. In other words, William Afton had the contact of somebody in the administration wing who was able to get him the contact information of all the other employees at Murray's Costume Manor. But if you look at the administration wing, there's really just 3 offices. There's Edwin's, the big one up the stairs that's very obviously Edwin. There's one filled with Chica merchandise and different design documents, which seem like it's more likely to be Fiona's office. And then there's a 3rd office filled with technology. I have a personal theory that there were 3 administrators at Murray's Costume Manor: Edwin and Fiona Murray and Henry Emily. After all, for the longest time, a lot of people had been speculating that Henry originally had his own business and joined together with William, bringing over Chica and a few other characters to form Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And this lines up with that theory perfectly, but now with evidence. This game takes place in 1979. This company takeover took place at least 5 months ago, but likely over a year ago. So Henry could have originally been with Murray's Costume Manor before ever joining on to Fazbear's, to which then William offers him a much better position, one where he could even manage that new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. We already know that Murray's Costume Manor was being commissioned to create Freddy Fazbear's Pizza animatronics, and if this theory is true, Henry is still the creator of those animatronics, just not under William Afton yet. Then he would have jumped ship when he saw the writing on the wall of MCM. After all, he's got a daughter to take care of. He needs a stable job. It is literally the night before this video goes up and I just thought of something. I checked and verified it, and I just need to put this in, so walk with me. In the showroom lobby, there are these portraits, one of Edwin, one of Fiona. There's a blank space in the middle. Now, there's a lot of speculation what that is, but this lines up really well with the idea of Henry being the 3rd executive, because this wouldn't have been his father. His father died before these portraits would have been necessary. This wouldn't be David, because this is a business showroom and they all have placards. Why would David need a placard? He's a child. This space was the 3rd executive. This space was Henry Emily. That's why we don't get to see it. Sorry, I'm losing my mind. Anyway, with all this evidence in mind, what does the story of Henry Emily look like? in Five Nights at Freddy's. Henry was an incredible engineer, and one of the most valuable assets that Murray's Costume Manor had, able to make many of Edwin's animatronics come to life, and William Afton knew that. In the plans to expand Fredbear's Family Diner into the Freddy Fazbear franchise, he'd need that help. He would need that expertise, and while he's at it, he would need more assets in general. So William began dragging out the contract he had with MCM, wasting the time and money of an already fragile and suffering company, making it as shaky and unsteady as possible. And right when it's getting worse than it's ever been, William Afton reaches out to Henry Emily directly. After all, if Edwin, quote, gets the change orders from Hen, then it seems like the workflow was that as an administrator, Henry Emily would directly receive the design requests from William Afton and Fazbear's Pizza, and then forward them to Edwin for approval once he looked them over, which would mean William Afton had direct access and communication to Henry Emily, someone who would have been high up enough to have all the contact information for the rest of the staff, willing to give it to William in exchange for a solid position at Fazbear's Pizza and a managerial role at their new location. In other words, in order to save himself and make sure he had money to protect his kid, he co-founded Freddy Fazbear's Pizza with William Afton. After enough time, MCM fully collapses, and when the dust settles in 1983, William and Henry open up Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. But then, sometime after, either due to jealousy of Henry's family and talents, or the blame of the death of the crying child, William Afton kills Charlotte Emily outside of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, which sends Henry into a grief spiral. And he's out of the narrative for the majority of the timeline after this. It's speculated what he's doing during this time. Some people think he's framed for the MCI and is in prison. Others think the grief is too much and he's just in a depressive, isolated state until he comes back. But whatever that moment of time was, eventually he learns that whatever's going on at Fazbear's is still happening and needs to be stopped. And he knows someone like him is the only one that can do it. Someone with the knowledge of the franchise and knowledge of animatronics enough to fully stop this. So he begins the Pizzeria Simulator plan, a trap to lure every single related person into one place, gather them all, lock them in, and incinerate them so there's nothing left behind. And with all the material still attached to their souls gone, hopefully, those souls can finally find rest, including himself, as he states,
I could make myself sleep, but not yet. Not until I undo what he has done and heal this wound.
And as far as we're aware, that's where his story ends. The crying child is a character that's in central focus of Five Nights at Freddy's. But that being said, how much do we actually know about this kid? I mean, for Christ's sake, he's a main character of the franchise, and most people still call him the crying child. We don't even have close to a confirmed name for him. He's Afton's youngest son. I thought it would be helpful to go over all of the confirmed information we have, some of the speculation, and my personal thoughts on where he fits in the timeline, like we did for Casty a couple weeks ago. Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. The first real mentions of the crying child start in FNAF 4. After all, that game is basically about him. The game presents itself as the nightmares of the crying child, this kid. He remains nameless through the entire game, seems terrified of the animatronics, is relentlessly bullied by his older brother, and takes solace in this Fredbear plushie that is seen everywhere throughout the daytime minigame. But this bullying comes to a head, where on his birthday, the older brother in the Foxy mask and his friends pick up the crying child and place his head inside of the jaw of the Fredbear Springlock animatronic, which then shuts and doesn't necessarily kill him. There's dialogue immediately after of people seemingly talking to him in some sort of unconscious state, but at the end of that cutscene there is a flatline-like sound effect. So the thinking is that it sent him into some kind of coma or something, and then he eventually died. Not before hearing the voice that he thought was coming from Fredbear say, I will put you back together. Now, when this game came out, we didn't have much context for who these kids were. Many people did assume that they were William Afton's children, but to be fair, by the time of FNAF 4, we didn't even have the name William Afton. The Silver Ice didn't come out until after this game. In the very next game, Sister Location, we got a lot more context to better color FNAF 4. At first, Sister Location does seem like a completely self-contained game, but by the end of it, we start learning more and more about the grander franchise, especially in the private office. Inside of there's monitors and a keypad, and if you punch in 1983, the same year that gets referenced in the daytime minigames, seemingly the year those games take place, the monitors next to it light up with shots of the house we see in the FNAF 4 nightmares. Pair that with the identical Fredbear plushie and walkie-talkie next to them, and the context this game provides that this whole area is William Afton's laboratory, and pieces start to fall together. The community began to settle on the crying child, and by extension his foxy mask-wearing brother, being children of William Afton, who was keeping an eye on them through this walkie-talkie plush and the cameras while doing whatever experiments he did down in these bunkers. William Afton being the same man who did the missing child incident and owned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. But interestingly enough, even though this game gave us the names of the other two children, that being Michael, the older brother who survives, and Elizabeth, their sister who likely slept in this room, this game doesn't give us the name of the crying child. And that's a trend that's continued for the rest of the series, because anytime the crying child is even remotely mentioned, he's still not named. Well, maybe except for one possibility, but we'll get there in due time. And that's all the confirmed information about the crying child, which is admittedly incredibly sparse. So let's talk about possible references to the crying child. Now that we know the general aesthetic of the crying child and that he's very closely related to Fredbear, many people believe that the FNAF 3 Happiest Day minigame is all about attempting to help the crying child move on. And I think that's a really solid theory. After all, FNAF 4 came out right after FNAF 3, which was basically about the happiest day. The crying child's last conscious thought is his Fredbear plushie and all of his animatronic friends saying, "We'll put you back together," and in Happiest Day, a bunch of kids wearing the masks of those animatronics put pieces together to help this crying child move on. Not to mention how this scene perfectly mirrors the scene of the crying child's bite. After all, we have these tables that line up really well, and a final room with masked figures affecting the crying child's life. Like, it is incredibly likely, if not near confirmed, that Happiest Day is laying the crying child to rest. But the question about this theory becomes when. Because theoretically, the crying child could move on pretty much at any point in the timeline. As far as we're aware, he doesn't necessarily affect the timeline in any way after he's died. But looking at this minigame, it seems very likely that the other children in the minigame move on as well once the crying child moves on himself. And we know that can't happen until FNAF 6, so we'll put a pin in the timeline of that for now. Another possible reference to the crying child are the Bear of Vengeance cutscenes that you can unlock in Ultimate Custom Night. They feature an anime-style dialogue between Freddy and Foxy and Mangle. Freddy trying but failing to conquer Foxy, and Foxy laughing about how easy it is to beat Freddy. Interpretations for these cutscenes go all over the place. Sometimes it's William and Henry, sometimes it's Elizabeth and Michael. But a fairly common interpretation I think is useful to bring up is that Freddy represents the crying child, Foxy represents Michael, and Mangle represents Elizabeth. After all, Michael did wear a Foxy mask and was constantly bullying his younger brother, who probably never got a leg up on him. And then Mangle would be Elizabeth, because if this is Elizabeth's room, clearly she liked Mangle. Again, this is just speculation, but if this connection is true, really the only purpose could show us that seemingly Elizabeth helped Michael bully the crying child, but not much else is gleaned from that. And speaking of weird side games, we do need to talk about FNAF World, because while FNAF World never really directly addresses the crying child, it does talk about FNAF 3 Happiest Day. After all, many people, and myself included, see FNAF World as sort of a retelling of the Happiest Day in general. When you're doing the clock ending, you basically recreate all the steps to access the Happiest Day in FNAF 3. And finally, once you do all of that, you're told that the whole point was to help somebody find their way, to leave breadcrumbs for them, aka helping somebody to move on. If that interpretation is true, then FNAF World is similarly completely built around the idea of helping the crying child move on. And it's for those reasons, plus all of the connections of Ultimate Custom Night and FNAF World, that I believe Happiest Day takes place after FNAF 6, likely during the fire of it. After all, everyone would be gathered in the same place, and their connection to this realm would be weakened by the incineration. It seems like the perfect time to try to reach out and help the crying child finally find peace. And there's one other source of information about the crying child. We need to bring it up because it's one of the most heavily debated sources of information about the character, but it's not actually a book. Once again, we're going to be talking about the good old security logbook. And if y'all thought the Cassidy puzzle was arbitrary, you're not ready for this one, which isn't even heavily agreed upon. We discussed a couple videos ago that this book was not only used to learn more about Michael Afton and discover the name Cassidy for the vengeful spirit, but it seems clear that the crying child is also involved in this book. He is the one that's changing the text on the page in order to communicate. After all, it fits in logically with what his general character is, and the things he says are very wimpy, which fits in, like I can't see, I don't know, and things like that. So naturally, people were using this book endlessly to see if we could solve what the crying child's name was using it. That way we would finally have all of the names of the Afton family. Well, except for Mrs. Afton, but she never really comes up and Scott doesn't like naming women, so. For a long time, nobody could agree on a methodology on finding the name of the crying child. Someone at one point found the name Evan, but while the evidence for E, V, and A was pretty good, the evidence for the N was lacking, and it was sort of just a, well, this is kind of a name. But recently, Hyperdroid made an incredibly compelling video solving the name of the crying child using this book, and with his methodology built off of what we knew from the EVA, he settled on the name Dave. And frankly, it's a theory I believe in. I like to believe the crying child's name is Dave. And it's also a harmless theory, right? Like, if we're wrong about the crying child's name, that doesn't really change anything about the timelines we create. It just makes it easier to say Dave than the crying child. And there are some really cool connections you can make if it's true, like the fact that in the Silver Eyes, William Afton uses the fake name Dave Miller, and this franchise has a history of characters using the fake names of dead characters, so this lines up very well. But to be very clear, this is incredibly heavy speculation. As confident as I am in the theory that the crying child's name is Dave, it is just that, a theory. It's also relatively newer, so most people still use the term the crying child when talking about the character. Not only is Dave not confirmed, but the theory is only like a year or so old, so it hasn't really caught on yet either. And that's everything we know about the crying child, which again, frankly, is not a lot. But the overarching question always comes back to, why does any of this matter? Why should we know things about the crying child? After all, like I've mentioned, he doesn't really affect the timeline in any way directly. But that's the thing. The crying child isn't important for what he does. The crying child is important for what he inspires in other characters. Not only are seemingly two different games completely focused around helping the crying child to move on, but there are many arguments to be made that William Afton's motivation to begin killing in the first place was to save the crying child's life. After all, once the crying child is bitten, one of the things we hear is a voice saying, "I will put you back together." Since it seems likely that William Afton was talking through the Fredbear plushie from what we see in Sister Location, we can assume that that voice is likely William Afton, promising his dying son that he will find some way to bring him back, to fix what has happened to him, which would essentially be trying to find immortality. In this interpretation, you could contextualize everything William does as stemming from this core purpose, to find immortality to save his dying son, and then eventually getting mad with power and trying to manipulate life itself, which does line up with what we know about William Afton from the Silver Eyes, who does have a goal of trying to become immortal, whether that be because of a fear of the afterlife because he's sure he's going to hell, or just a manic obsession with power. Annual disclaimer, this is not me saying that I believe in will care, the theory that William Afton actually really cares about his children. Very clear he doesn't. He sees them as tools to use at best. Now, I didn't say that I believe in will care in this video, I didn't even imply it, but people are so weirdly angry about that theory that if I don't make this disclaimer, I'm gonna get like 50 angry DMs and I just don't want to deal with it. Anyway, with all of this evidence and speculation in mind, I think we can craft a pretty good timeline around the crying child and what his role in the story is. So let's do just that. William Afton was very busy doing whatever it was that he thought was more important than actually taking care of his children. So he came up with a solution. Not only would he watch them through cameras he placed throughout his home, but he would keep track of one of them, the youngest, with a Fredbear plushie he could talk through. And of course have Michael Afton watch over the kid. Sure, Michael picked on his younger brother out of resentment for having to watch him, but that wasn't William's problem. Until it was, when one day the bullying went so far as it led to the accidental death of that very same youngest son. And although William Afton promises to fix him, he eventually dies. But his life was so messy and tragic, with memories left all over the place, that his mind is too broken to move on. He's unable to possess anything, unable to interact or remember what his life even was. All he can do is suffer in silence, alone. And this is how it goes for quite some time, until eventually a spirit does notice him, trying to reach out, asking about his memories, trying to figure out who this child is. And from his own responses, he doesn't even know much. It isn't until someone exceptionally in tune with the spirit realm in a moment where everyone is loosely connected to the world that this very same someone is able to contact him, attempting to give any sort of peace to the child. At the FNAF 6 fire, everyone had been gathered and incinerated together, and Charlotte Emily, someone well versed in helping spirits move on or possess things, is able to see the memories of all the victims in that fire, and in it find the crying child, and using whatever she can and whatever help she can gather to put his mind back together, finally allowing the crying child to find peace and rest. It would ultimately be up to him to follow the breadcrumb trail they'd made for him, but the happiest day was formed for him to follow. His birthday was fixed, all in the hopes that the crying child may finally have his day and rest. And that's everything. So why do people think that Gregory is the crying child? And why does the crying child have the same bedroom as the mimic? And why does Dave sound an awful lot like David Murray? Honestly, we don't have time for all that. Look at how long this video took just to talk about what the crying child is in the story. We don't have time to talk about what it isn't or what it inspired. As far as the crying child himself goes, this is pretty much it. Circus Baby is one of the most recognizable FNAF characters in the entire franchise, and the lore about her is somewhat loose and somewhat direct. So I thought it would be helpful to go through all of the lore of Circus Baby, and by extension, Elizabeth Afton, and consolidate it into this video, like we've done before a couple times. Slices, put on your aprons, and let's make ourselves a theory. I usually think it makes the most sense to start with the explanation of the character in lore, and then move on to every game where we get evidence of that character, so you know why they exist, and how we know they exist, and then we go over all the information about them. But lucky for us, everything besides the name of the spirit inside Circus Baby is told to us in her introductory game. Understandable, since Circus Baby is arguably the main character of the game she's introduced in, but we hear a lot about Circus Baby and the daughter of her inventor in the game Five Nights at Freddy's Sister Location. One of the first things we learn in Sister Location at all is that Circus Baby has some features that has investors worried. We don't hear what it is in the intro, but later on we get these blueprints that, you know, it describes, I guess, normal animatronic things, but then you see like the silhouette of a kid inside her chassis. Partway through the game, if you break off from the intended path and hide under the desk, Circus Baby tells you this story where she's at a party with various numbers of children, but eventually she's alone with one child. And when she is, her programming takes over. And in the story, it's not super clear what happens. She just says there was screaming and then silence, but it's implied that she killed the child. And we see a different angle of what seems to be this scenario in the cupcake minigame. Now, you have to originally get it from a random death, but once you do, you can access it from the extras menu. And in that cupcake minigame, if you do it perfectly and make it back to the beginning, which is difficult, you get this cutscene, where she places down an ice cream cone, a little girl goes to take it, and a claw extends from her stomach and grabs her. I, and many others, it's not a huge leap, think that this is showing us the scene that was described earlier. Circus Baby was alone with a little girl and killed her. Not to mention the whole point of Sister Location is that Circus Baby and the other Funtime animatronics are trying to form into Ennard to get into the body of Michael Afton so they can sneak out. But when they first form Ennard, if you break off into the private office, Circus Baby talks to you as Ennard, trying to convince you to let them in. And when that doesn't work, she switches to a little girl's voice. The same little girl that we hear in between nights of Sister Location. So what about this little girl that I keep talking about? In between every night of Sister Location, we hear the voice of a little girl talking to her father, asking to go play with Circus Baby. She mentions that her father made Circus Baby for her, but he won't let her see it. And eventually on the last night, we hear that she sneaks away from her father and goes to see Circus Baby alone. This, combined with all the other weirdness I mentioned, leads many people to believe this is the voice of the girl who gets killed and then possesses Circus Baby. The possession is speculation, but one of the key pieces of evidence is that in the 8-bit minigame before Circus Baby kills the little girl, she has blue eyes and the little girl has green. But in every iteration of Circus Baby since then, Circus Baby has green eyes. And, you know, the fact that Circus Baby talks using that little girl's voice. Like I mentioned as well, during that Ennard boss fight, the lines in the little girl's voice are specifically things like, "We need you so we can leave," "Didn't you come back here to be with me again?" and stuff like that. Not only implying that she's talking as the little girl, but that our player knows this little girl in some way. The game presents that this little girl was killed by Circus Baby, the little girl who's the daughter of the inventor of Circus Baby. Again, note the eye color change. We know that the person who invented this animatronic is Mr. Afton from the intro. Obviously William Afton from context outside of this game. So this is Afton's daughter. Now as far as sister location goes, this is all we get about Afton's daughter and Circus Baby. But again, it's important to note that at the end of sister location, Circus Baby and all the other Funtime animatronics have turned into Ennard, entered Michael's body, left the bunker, and then left Michael's body into the sewers. This is a first for our little character study mini-series, but we're going to source something that's not a game or a book. In fact, we're sourcing source code, the source code of two websites, Scott Games and FNAFworld.com. In the lead up to Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator, the source code of ScottGames.com and FNAFworld.com started to have a bit of a conversation with each other, which read, "You are crowding us. Be quiet. You can't tell us what to do anymore. Yes, I can. You will do everything that I tell you to do. We outnumber you. That doesn't matter, dummy. We found a way to eject you. You would be lost without me. Ha ha, say goodbye to our friend. I can put myself back together." So like, whew. But judging from the mannerisms that FNAFworld.com uses, things like dummy, be quiet, and stuff like that, many people took this conversation as the voice of Circus Baby conversing with the voice of the other Funtimes within Ennard. The other spirits of Ennard seemingly having enough with Elizabeth and kicking her out of the collective, which would then split Ennard into two separate entities, which makes sense considering the very next game, Five Nights at Freddy's Pizzeria Simulator, where we have Molten Freddy and Scrap Baby. At the beginning of FNAF 6, we get this teaser of Scrap Baby herself, a messed up and semi-melted version of Circus Baby. Now, she has a lot of voice lines in this game, as do most of the animatronics. They have death lines and lines they say when they near you, but for Scrap Baby in particular, many of her voice lines relate to the idea that she thinks she's here at the behest of the creator of the Pizzeria Simulator. She has lines like, "You really don't know who your employer is, do you? I heard your call, it feels like home." Some of her death quotes lean into this as well. Things like, "It feels like my birthday, do you have a gift for me?" Or, "You're not who I expected to see." Like I said, all of these have a vibe that she thinks she's working for someone in particular, and her lines in her part of the monologue of the completion ending confirm this fact, where she says,
You played right into our hands. Did you really think that this job just fell out of the sky for you? No, this was a gift for us. You gathered them all together in one place, just like he asked you to. All of those little souls in one place, just for us. A gift. Now we can do what we were created to do and be complete. I will make you proud, Daddy. Watch, listen, and be full.
And that's when the other shoe drops. Elizabeth Afton assumes that she was called to this Pizzeria Simulator by William Afton, assuming that he had made this whole plan to draw in all of the animatronics and put full completed souls into each of them, finally putting everyone back together and bringing back to life all of these dead children. Well, part of that is speculation. It's clear that she thinks William Afton has some grand plan for this place, but she never gets to say what it is. Because as we know, she is mistaken, as Henry immediately tells her she was called here, but not by William Afton. This was all Henry's plan to trap everyone and melt them to the ground. In fact, it's Henry that finally confirms her name. After all, the very next line is the beginning of his famous monologue, where he starts with,
Connection terminated. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Elizabeth. If you still even remember that name.
And it's in this game that her story pretty much ends, in the FNAF 6 fire, where everyone burns and their spirits are released. Now that's Circus Baby's and Elizabeth Afton's major story arc within the games. which is admittedly just 2 games. But there are references to her as a person and character throughout the rest of the franchise. In FNAF 4, there's a bedroom that we never see anybody living in, but it does have a picture of a pink flower, there's mangle on the floor, it's considered girlier, so many people assume that this is Afton's daughter's room, this is Elizabeth's room. And that does make sense, but we never see her in these cutscenes, so take it as you will. I mentioned it before, but some folks think that in the Ultimate Custom Night cutscenes, Bearer of Vengeance, that mangle is supposed to represent Elizabeth Afton, because in these cutscenes, Freddy would be the crying child, Foxy would be Michael Afton, and the girlier thing that helps him would be Elizabeth Afton. This would be implying that Elizabeth Afton took part in the bullying of the crying child, but again, that's all speculation. It's also, like, extraneous information. It tells us about their dynamic, not necessarily why she died. And for a while, that was all the major references to Circus Baby or Elizabeth Afton, until most recently with Help Wanted 2. Help Wanted 2 has a significant portion of its gameplay dedicated to Sister Location. Now, part of this might be because Sister Location was sorely absent from the majority of Help Wanted 1, but it's notable that the end of this Sister Location section is sort of a boss fight with Circus Baby. You have to do different minigames and protect yourself from her. Meanwhile, she taunts you and even says the line throughout the game, "What makes you so special?" Until eventually you beat her, she extends an ice cream to you, and you take it and survive. Look, on the surface, this isn't incredibly notable for lore. She doesn't necessarily do anything here, but it's weird, right? Like, I would be remiss to not bring this up. You could argue, sure, the Help Wanted games are just compilations of older games, so it makes sense, but 1, this never happened in Sister Location, and 2, Help Wanted 1 is a compilation. Help Wanted 2 is mostly original things, except for Sister Location. So it's just strange. And that's pretty much everything. Granted, Elizabeth Afton does show up in the novels, and Circus Baby shows up in not only the movie, but very prominently in the Silver Eyes novel trilogy. But they aren't super related to the games, and in both the novel trilogy and the movie, they are taken in very different directions from the games, so they're not that relevant or important to the game lore of Elizabeth Afton and Circus Baby. Besides, with the game information we have, there's already a pretty clear timeline here. I basically already said the timeline just listing out the evidence. It's genuinely impressive that a character who realistically only shows up in 2 of the games of the franchise has this clear of a timeline attached to them. Meanwhile, a character like Michael Afton's in basically every FNAF game, and who knows what the hell he's doing. Regardless, here's the timeline, I think, of Elizabeth Afton. William Afton was working on the Circus Baby's Pizza World front, a restaurant filled with fun-time animatronics that were built perfectly to kidnap children. They could distract parents, lure in children, capture them, and bring them to the bunker to extract their remnant or do whatever William was planning. But in the lead up to it, he told his daughter, Elizabeth Afton, and maybe the other members of the family, that he built the Fun Times in reference to them. And Circus Baby, the star of the show, was in reference to Elizabeth. But he warned her never to play with Elizabeth alone, or never to go close to the robot at all, not telling her that the reason was if she got too close it would attempt to kidnap her. But Elizabeth Afton was infatuated. I mean, her father barely pays attention to her, and suddenly he's made a 10-foot-tall gift for her? Of course she's going to want to play with it. And she does get alone with Circus Baby, and just as she does, an ice cream is offered. But when she goes to take it, Circus Baby's programming kicks in, and it attempts to kidnap Elizabeth Afton, messily and sloppily, in a way that ends up killing her. Such a resounding embarrassment and failure for William Afton leads him to cancel the entire project a day before it was meant to come out, taking it all to the Circus Baby party and rental, and never opening Pizza World. But Elizabeth Afton's spirit was not done here. The eyes of Circus Baby changed. Her spirit possessed the suit that was made for her, in a admittedly and rather interestingly clean possession. Her consciousness seems mostly intact, if not possibly melded with the personality of Circus Baby. William Afton would likely go on to do experiments and try to capitalize on this new information, but eventually he was stopped for some reason or another, and the Funtime animatronics were left down in the Sister Location bunker to rot, until eventually Michael Afton is sent down there via instructions from his father. And when she sees him there, everything starts to fall into place. These animatronics and Circus Baby herself can finally leave this cursed bunker as long as they can use this body to get out with. Throughout the week, Elizabeth as Circus Baby manipulates and leads Michael into trusting her above anything else. And with this trust, she leads him into the scooping room, scooping out Michael's insides and having enter the body. They're able to use the skin suit to leave the bunker and finally get out of this hell that they've been stuck in, but only for a short time. The skin suit rots rather quickly, and they have to escape to the sewers. It's during this time that, at an unknown point, the other spirits of the Funtime animatronics and Elizabeth have a falling out, disagreeing on what they should do. Elizabeth is certain that William Afton has a plan to make all of them fixed and better, but the others don't believe her. They split off and go their separate ways. This forms Scrap Baby, the new version that Elizabeth is possessing, and it's as Scrap Baby that she finally hears the call she's been searching for, and she seeks it out. Finally finding her father's plan, the one that will make everything right, it will make all of this worth it, it'll basically be like being born anew. And once she gets there, she finds out that she's mistaken. It wasn't her father's call, but her father's old partner, Henry Emily. It was a call to draw everyone in, melt down their suits, and allow their spirits to rest. And as far as we're aware, it's in this moment that Elizabeth Afton finally finds peace. I didn't mention this in the Crying Child's video, but I find it pertinent to mention now. One of the FNAF World endings shows this image, and I like to think that this image is showing us one thing that only happens after FNAF 6 and FNAF World. Michael Afton, Elizabeth Afton, and the Crying Child cuddled around a TV, relaxing and enjoying each other's company in the afterlife. It tracks with what we know about the afterlife of the FNAF games. After all, whenever it's described in the books or games, it's sort of described as being inside of a good memory for the rest of eternity. And what is this but being inside of a good memory with her siblings, happy? It's an ending I hope for her. And that's my timeline for Elizabeth Afton based on the evidence we have of her character. What if I told you every Five Nights at Freddy's game had the same protagonist? Behind every fake name, every hidden mission, one person was at each location trying his best to survive. Well, a lot of people think that very same thought, but if you're new to the franchise or just need a refresher, why is that? I think it's past due we go through all the lore we have about Michael Afton, set apart what's definitive lore, what's speculation, and what my thoughts are on his personal timeline. Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. And real quick, I just want to address something. I've done a lot of these and I hear some people saying, we know this stuff, why are you covering it? Twofold. One, we got no FNAF news, I gotta eat. But two, there's new people coming to this franchise all the time, and I figured videos like this would be helpful to old and new fans to get a refresher on what is concrete lore and what is fan speculation, because the waters get muddy over the decade-long franchise this is. Regardless, how do we even know Michael Afton exists? Compared to other characters in the franchise, we actually have a pretty easy time figuring out whether or not Michael Afton exists, because he introduces himself in his first ever monologue. At the end of Sister Location, if you beat the custom night, you get this line.
Father, it's me, Michael.
Because that alone tells us so much. Father is likely referring to Mr. Afton from the beginning of the same game, and Michael, so Michael Afton. Clear as day. And from this monologue, we know that he's the protagonist of Sister Location, that the Scooper ending is the canon one, and that after Sister Location, he's hunting down William Afton. And that's a lot. We also know that he was sent down here under the direction to put her back together. Likely the little girl inside of Circus Baby, who we know from this video is Elizabeth Afton. And that's a lot. Again, this is just the first game he speaks in. But from there, and now that we know he exists, what else can we know definitively about him? Well, if we look at FNAF 4, and we know that he's the son of William Afton, and we're pretty certain the Crying Child is the son of William Afton, that all but confirms this older brother in a foxy mask to be Michael Afton. So we know that he bullied his younger brother to the point of accidentally killing him in the bite of 83. Some people also speculate that he is the protagonist of the Nightmare gameplay of FNAF 4, but we'll save that for speculation. For now, we know nearly definitively that he's the older brother in the FNAF 4 minigames. Where else are we fairly certain he shows up? Now, it is a bit more speculative, but it is fairly definitive that Michael Afton is the protagonist of FNAF 3, for several reasons. Some of the looser evidence is that in the survival logbook, Foxy is the stand-in guard for the FNAF 3 location, Foxy being related to Michael Afton because of the mask thing. Some stronger evidence is that all of the phantoms are animatronics Michael Afton would have seen, so if it's hallucinations, that makes sense. And even if it's some weird agony projection from William Afton, it would still make sense to be basing off of the memories of Michael. But frankly, I think the strongest evidence is that monologue we touched on from Sister Location, because it's not just any backdrop. During the monologue, we see the charred and burned down remains of Fazbear Frights, the haunted house of FNAF 3, and at the very end, a burnt Springtrap gets up out of the rubble. We also know that in FNAF 3, according to the last newspaper, the haunted house burns down at the end of the week of Michael working there. So, piecing this together, it seems very likely that Michael Afton, after saying, "I'm going to come find you," eventually found Fazbear Frights, a haunted house collecting memorabilia of Fazbear, and stuck around to see if his dad would show up. And son of a bitch, he did. And once he confirmed that Springtrap was in fact the corpse of his late father, William Afton, and was in fact alive, then he attempted to burn the whole place down to get rid of him. So it seems fairly definitive that Michael Afton is the protagonist of FNAF 3. And it's barely evident, so I didn't want to mention it, but I should mention that some people also think that it's Michael because of the jump scares of FNAF 3. The fact that Springtrap doesn't necessarily attack you, but just like looks at you real aggressively. Some people argue that's on purpose because William Afton is shocked to see Michael Afton in the flesh, but I think that's a post-hoc justification for an admittedly bad jump scare. Now, some people argue that the protagonist of FNAF 3 isn't Michael Afton, but instead this guy named Hudson from Fazbear Frights. I don't think there's a lot of water for this theory. The only evidence is that there's a story that seems a lot like FNAF 3 that has the character named Hudson being the night guard. But like, everything else is really weird about it. It just doesn't line up well. So I think the evidence here pretty definitively points us to Michael Afton being the protagonist for FNAF 3, and trying to light the building on fire to kill William Afton for good, which of course doesn't work. But what if he tried again? The protagonist for FNAF 6, Pizzeria Simulator, is definitely up for debate, but I think the evidence here nearly definitively points us to Michael Afton. And that's mainly from this line from Henry.
And to you, my brave volunteer, who somehow found this job listing not intended for you. Although there was a way out planned for you, I have a feeling that's not what you want. I have a feeling that you are right where you want to be.
Now, some people take this line to argue that the protagonist is anybody except Michael Afton. The argument being that Henry Emily intended Michael Afton to be here, so this job listing was not intended for our player character. But I don't think that holds up because of the second half of the line. There was an exit intended for you, but I have a feeling that's not what you want. I have a feeling you're right where you want to be. Let's walk through the logic here for a moment. If this was intended for a random bystander to accept the job, why would he assume the random bystander would want to die with the franchise? Whereas, if he was planning this for Michael, why would he plan an escape route for Michael? Surely he would assume Michael Afton wants to go down with the ship at this point. I think it makes much more sense that he planned this job listing for anybody willing to do the work, someone who could help with this. And because they were an innocent bystander to the Fazbear tragedies, an exit was planned for the intended volunteer. But throughout the week, Henry Emily realizes that somehow Michael Afton is alive and he's the willing volunteer. That's why he didn't intend this job listing to be for Michael. He probably thought he was dead, especially if he had his hands on any material from Sister Location, and we know he got blueprints from that bunker. If he saw footage on a security camera or something of him being scooped, of course he'd assume Michael's dead. So all of a sudden he's back and he's like, I didn't intend for you to be here, but if you want to die with us, you're welcome to. That makes sense. And if this protagonist is Michael Afton, FNAF 6 is where his story mostly ends. He realizes that Henry Emily is trying to gather everyone related to Fazbear and burn it all to the ground, and he wants to participate in that. He wants to help end this thing that should have ended years ago. And once everyone has been collected, he, like Henry, recognizes that he needs to go down with the ship too for this to truly be over. And he can finally be at rest. Kind of. Now we're about to move on to speculation, so I'm going to already dip my toes in the speculation of this game, and specifically two parts of this game. Well, one part of this game and one part of the games attached to this game. The part of this game I think is speculation, but I do agree with, is that Midnight Motorist, the minigame where a guy comes home in a purple car, bangs on a door, his son escaped through a broken window, and some person on the couch was like, leave him alone. I think that minigame is depicting William Afton, Mrs. Afton, and Michael Afton. Essentially, I think that Michael Afton is the runaway, someone breaking out of a window to get out of this house to go to that place again. That place being either the crying child's grave or the nearby lake. How do we know there's a nearby lake? it's speculation, but Fall Fest is often depicted next to a lake surrounded by trees. And I've in the past linked that up to the Old Man Consequences Lake, which is a lake surrounded by trees. And that being said, some further speculation on Michael Afton I'm quite fond of that I expound in this video is I believe Old Man Consequences is Michael Afton. The Old Man Consequences from FNAF World and Ultimate Custom Night. The reason I think so is multifaceted. First of all, the sprite. This always looked like a weird alligator man. It never made total sense. But this face does in a way look like a pixel art representation of a Foxy mask, something that would make a lot of sense for Michael Afton. But secondly, narratively speaking, this makes a lot of sense to be Michael Afton. Think about where he is at the end of FNAF 6. He's finally helped everybody burn, but in the back of his mind, his brother and his sister were failed by him. He tried to put her back together, but obviously he failed. Look at Scrap Baby. And he was the one that led to the crying child's death. If Michael Afton had any agency as he's moving on, the idea that he would want to make sure that the crying child and Elizabeth moved on as well makes perfect sense. So imagine him as Old Man Consequences, just on the edge of the afterlife, in the in-between of whatever FNAF World and Ultimate Custom Night are, and the other side, waiting there by his favorite spot for his brother and sister to arrive. When he sees the vengeful spirit pass by, he warns the vengeful spirit, hey, it's not worth it. We've won. Let him be, and you should rest. Because that's all he wants at the end of the day. Especially considering the drowning ending in FNAF World. If you enter Old Man Consequences Lake, you're met with this image. This image has not made a lot of sense and has a lot of interpretations, but I like to see it as three silhouettes watching TV. Michael Afton in the middle, an arm around his younger brother and younger sister. He may have failed them in life, but in the afterlife, they can be a happy family again. They can have each other doing what Michael Afton loves most, watching TV. I think that's a sweet ending for him, and it's speculative, but I think it makes logical sense. And it's not the only speculation we have on Michael Afton, because there's arguments to be made that he's not only the protagonist of Sister Location and 6 and 3, but possibly 1, 2, and 4 as well. We've already discussed how Mike is likely the older brother in the minigames of FNAF 4, but what if I told you he's also the one having the nightmares? Now I know on the surface it does make the most sense for the crying child to be the one having these nightmares, but there's 2 points of evidence that I think lean more towards Michael Afton. One, the layout of the animatronic attacks is eerily similar to FNAF 1, and most damning, the FNAF 1 Night 1 phone call can be heard in reverse during one of the nights of FNAF 4, which doesn't make any sense if this is the crying child. Sure, it's a nightmare. We can excuse a FNAF 1 phone call randomly playing in a house, but for it to be in someone's nightmares, they would have had to heard it. And the crying child never worked at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. He died when he was like 5, but Michael Afton likely did. So then how do we explain this? Is this just nightmares that Michael Afton is having? Well then why does the crying child have such similar nightmares? This is unfortunately when we get into the hallucinogenic gas possibility of it all. One of the Tales in the Pizzaplex stories is called Didophobia, and it shows us essentially another angle of something that smells a lot like FNAF 4. A kid named Rory is trapped in this barren testing chamber with mannequins on sticks that come at him every night, and it's constantly being filled with hallucinogenic gas to make everything seem real. His entire life is waking up, wandering around his house a little dazed and confused and somewhat tired, and then giving up and going back to bed. Then having a horrific nightmare that's identical to FNAF 4. And we learn in this story that this chamber is attached to the Sister Location bunker. Now, this is an insane story, and I don't think this story exists in the games, but a chamber like this does make sense to, unfortunately. And that's mainly because of the private office in Sister Location, where in it we see these screens of the FNAF 4 location. One that's different from the house we see in the daytime minigames. Not to mention that on the Fuse map, we see this and this, which are both layouts from FNAF 4. So it seems like these games are suggesting that Sister Location Bunker and the FNAF 4 location are connected in some way. So if these chambers do exist, well, I think that might explain these similar nightmares. My thinking is that if these chambers existed before the death of the crying child, that William Afton may have taken Michael Afton and put him into the chambers as punishment for what happened to the crying child. Now, to be clear, I don't think it's because William Afton cares about his kid or anything like that. Rather, I think it was William Afton angry that he embarrassed the company. I mean, the crying child, the son of William Afton, dying in the main mascot of your restaurant is a bad look on a good day. But doing this is sort of a three birds with one stone situation. If he's the midnight motorist escapee, the kid who keeps running away, then this would keep him contained. He's also a perfect test subject because no one's going to check up on him because it's his son. There's no one to report him missing. And thirdly, it's petty revenge for what happened at the business. And so if Michael Afton was being put in these nightmare chambers, then he was experiencing this torture over and over. And then even when he gets out, if he goes to the FNAF 1 location and experiences something similar in real life, the idea that his nightmares would be colored by this makes perfect sense. But if he was being put in these nightmare chambers, he'd also be incredibly manipulatable. And if so, what would William Afton manipulate Michael into doing? The main argument for him being the protagonist of 1 and 2 is the linking of the characters Mike Schmidt and Fritz Smith. Two of these likely fake names who were working at the Fazbear locations. The reason they're linked is they were fired for the exact same reason: tampering with the animatronics, general unprofessionalism, odor. Now, some people attribute the odor thing to the whole walking corpse stuff, which does work, but personally, I think these events happened before Sister Location. So for me, I have a different explanation, which admittedly is very speculative, but it's based off the loose evidence we'd already talked about in FNAF 4. Think about the fact that he gets fired twice, specifically for tampering with the animatronics. I could see a very likely scenario, one that I went into in this video, the idea that William Afton was manipulating Michael Afton to essentially be his right-hand man, or his fall guy, more accurately. So in this logic, Fritz Smith and Mike Schmidt would be fake names used by Michael Afton in order to retrieve metal off of the animatronics for William Afton. In essence, Michael Afton would be part of the protagonist of FNAF 2 and the main protagonist of FNAF 1. And in essence, that would make Michael Afton the protagonist for every single Scott Games FNAF game, excluding UCN and FNAF World. Mike Schmidt in 1, Fritz Smith in FNAF 2, the player in 3, the Nightmare Haver in 4, the player in Sister Location, and the Brave Volunteer in Pizzeria Simulator. So with all this in mind, what does Michael Afton's timeline look like? Michael Afton grew to resent his little brother. Their father having no time to watch them, he was made babysitter against his will. This led to bullying, but bullying that got much too intense, and eventually led to the untimely death of the crying child, something that stuck to Michael Afton moving forward. In the days that followed, he'd sneak out of the house and visit his brother's grave, have long nights staring out at his favorite lake, trying to get over this grief that he never would. And eventually, William Afton's anger towards Michael grew too great. Not necessarily because he cared about the crying child, but because he embarrassed him so thoroughly in his business. A kid dying in the mouth of your star animatronic is not a good look, let alone your own kid. So that, combined with him being sick of Michael Afton running away, William Afton decides to kill two birds with one stone. He puts Michael in the Nightmare Experiment Chambers. 1, now Michael can't escape, and he can keep a closer eye on him. 2, he'll have a test subject no one will follow up on. After all, it's his kid. Who knows him besides him? And 3, it's a bit of petty revenge for the embarrassment the company had to suffer under Michael Afton. Michael Afton would spend several years in these chambers, reliving this horrible nightmare scenario every day, until eventually William Afton steps in and says, "Hey, I think I can stop your nightmares. All you have to do is get a job at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and retrieve some metal for me." But as he tries to do this, he's promptly fired. William Afton says he's failed, and it won't work, and he puts him back in the chambers. Some time goes on until William Afton tries it again, this time at a different Freddy Fazbear's, and Michael Afton swears to be more stealthy this time. He lasts an entire week at the company, but eventually is once again caught and promptly fired. William Afton needs this metal, and he has no more time to wait. So he tells Michael, "Listen, if I don't make it back, go into the bunker and put her back together." And then he goes off to collect the metal himself. The Follow Me minigames happen and William Afton dies. Enough time goes by and Michael Afton has no one coming back for him. So he goes down into the Sister Location bunker, where we see that game play through pretty normally, as we'd expect. But as Michael is going through this bunker and trying to figure out how to put Elizabeth back together, he would stumble upon the private office, the documentation on everything that has happened to him, and realize that his father wasn't trying to save him or save his siblings. His father was their tormentor. But it's too late. By the time he realizes this, he's scooped out and Ennard wears his body to escape. but a combination of his own rage towards his father and the remnant left over on that scooper put into his body, and he, once again, lives. Michael Afton now only exists to hunt down his father, seeking anywhere he might find him. Still racked with nightmares of his experiences in those chambers, haunted by the guilt of his own brother, he vows to get William Afton. His first attempt is Fazbear's Fright, a haunted house collecting objects all based around Fazbear's. If his father would show up anywhere, it would be here. And he was right. Eventually, the suit of Spring Bonnie with the corpse of his father appears, walking around the hallways. It seems like he's not the only one who's cheated death. So he tries to burn the building down with William inside, but it doesn't work. Eventually, sometime later, he hears about a Freddy Fazbear's you can own. Anyone can own. They just have to put in the work. This can't be good. So he investigates, only to find that the subtle purpose of this is to lure in every player who remains in this story. And he immediately realizes that this is his true mission. This will end it all. And working with Henry Emily, he's able to lure in every single being still related to Fazbear and burn them all to the ground. Now he patiently waits in the afterlife until the crying child and Elizabeth find their peace too, so they can all rest together as a family again. And that is the entire timeline of Michael Afton. William Afton, a name that most people, even non-FNAF fans, know. He's the purple guy, the man behind the slaughter, the main villain of all of Five Nights at Freddy's. But a man with that much infamy honestly muddies his own water. How much of William Afton do we actually know for fact? And how much of it is speculation that we've been taken for granted? For example, we all know that William Afton is obsessed with immortality, but that's never once stated in-game. Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. Starting this off in a way that makes the most sense, how do we know William Afton exists in the first place? Well, technically, his name is first mentioned in the book The Silver Eyes, where he's the antagonist, a guy who owned the original Freddy's restaurant and is pretending to be somebody else to get close to it. He ends up trying to kill people again, but then they work against him, and eventually somebody activates the spring locks in the Spring Bonnie suit he's wearing, and it kills him. But again, he's named William Afton. And in the very next game, Sister Location, we get an opening of some shareholder talking to a Mr. Afton, who's making the animatronics. So that's pretty straightforward there. It's even more noteworthy that Sister Location is one of the first narrative-based games, and it opens with Mr. Afton. But if that's not enough for you, in FNAF 6, the last main game that Scott made, in the credits, the voice of Scraptrap is given the name William Afton. So there you go. So we know this guy's named William Afton, and that he is the guy who ends up as Scraptrap. What else do we know about him? Let's go game by game and talk about what we know about the purple guy. Like most of these lore videos, FNAF 1 is pretty quick, because at this point, Scott really didn't have a story in mind. This was his crapshoot game. So all we really know is that the missing child incident happened. It's something that, William Afton did, but we don't even find that out until later. We just know somebody killed kids here. We'll move on for now. At the time of FNAF 2's release, again, not really anything about William Afton, but in retrospect, we know for a fact that these death minigames we see are things that William Afton did. Save Them, Take Cake to the Children, and Foxy Go 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 in particular are showing William Afton's crimes. The missing child incident, the dead child incident, which we'll have to talk about eventually, and killing Charlotte Emily outside of a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. We also know from this sprite from Save Them that he was wearing some sort of badge, so likely he was working there at the time of Save Them, or at least put on the uniform. Either that or this is like a weird stain on his shirt. It's unclear. Scott's never been a great pixel artist. These aren't really technically pixel art, but regardless. And finally, we hear from Phone Guy that somebody used a yellow suit in the back that was not meant to be used, and then the animatronics started going haywire. We can again, with later context, assume this is William Afton. Moving on to FNAF 3, we get our first actual visual of William Afton. Many years after he died. It's Springtrap. Springtrap and his creations. The Phantom animatronics. Now, is Springtrap making them, or is it a hallucination because of lack of oxygen? It's unclear, because technically Agony could do that, but all we know for certain is that's William Afton, and he was found in a hidden wall broken into back room at a Freddy's location, according to the guy giving us phone calls. We also see in the in-between night minigames, the Follow Me minigames, how he ended up back there. He was at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza taking apart the animatronics one by one until eventually he was cornered by the spirits at that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, to which he puts on the Spring Bonnie suit to try to scare them off, but since it's dilapidated, it closes in on him, killing him inside, and leaving him stuck in that back room. Why exactly he's stuck back there is some light speculation, but we hear in this same game that there's a back room in every Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that is not on the cameras and animatronics do not understand it exists. So we see in the Follow Me minigames that they try to go in, but they can't, they keep getting stuck. There's, to them, nothing there. So I like to think that he's primarily stuck back there because since the spring lock's activated, Spring Bonnie is in show mode, and in show mode, Spring Bonnie doesn't understand this back room. It should not exist. So that might be why he's stuck back there, but that is technically speculation. There's just not a lot of lines to connect those dots. They're pretty close already. FNAF 4 is interesting because on one hand, canon-wise, what's in the text-wise, there's only one appearance of William Afton the entire time. Definitively. And that's helping this guy put a suit on in a back room. And frankly, that could be any guy in the shadows. It just kinda looks like William Afton because he's purple. That being said, with Sister Location, the very next game, showing a plush Fredbear with a walkie-talkie, many people think that these speech bubbles are William Afton talking to the crying child throughout his day. Is that actually what's happening? There's a lot of ways to interpret this. I have a pretty wild one on the podcast. If I remember to, I'll link it right here. That involves the whole entirety of FNAF 4 being fake. But as far as like the actual evidence here, in game, we really don't have a reason to believe that he is Fredbear. But with Sister Location in mind, it is heavily suggested that William Afton is the one speaking through the plush Fredbear. And in that sense, after the crying child dies, he promises to put him back together. So let's go to Sister Location. I already mentioned the game once. This is a big game for William Afton and Afton lore in general. Elizabeth, Michael, even the crying child a little bit. But like, this is a big, hey, let's learn about the Aftons kind of game. We learned that Circus Baby's Pizza World was going to be a thing. This is more in the teasers, but it's the idea that William Afton was doing these spin-offs. We learned that the Sister Location bunker is under the Afton household. We learned that Afton needed to appeal to shareholders to fund this business. So he's not made of endless money. He does need to fund this somehow. We know that the fun times he's creating are capable of kidnapping children according to the blueprints. We know that William sent his son, Michael Afton, into that bunker under the explicit directions of putting her back together, to which he does all of Sister Location, and we know that he didn't stick around. Now, what I mean by that is, Michael Afton's whole monologue at the end of Sister Location is like, I'm going to come find you. Something went wrong, it is your fault, I'm going to come find you. Which, frankly, would be a weird ending if William Afton is just around the bunker, like if he's just chilling in the living room. Michael Afton wouldn't have to say, I'm gonna come find you. He'd just have to go home, he's right there. So, I think this line is directly stating that William Afton is no longer in the picture by the end of Sister Location. I think William is likely gone before Sister Location even happens, and that's why Michael Afton goes down in the first place. But again, that's speculation. We just know that by the end of the game, William is MIA. But not for long, because in FNAF 6, Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator, he's back. Again. He always comes back. This is actually the first time in-game he says that, as far as I'm aware. Although I guess it's technically the first time he talks at all, so not a huge surprise. But we learn more than just William Afton showed up to the Pizzeria Simulator and burnt to a crisp. Most of the minigames in FNAF 6 directly feature William Afton. Fruity Maze shows one of the tactics William Afton used to kidnap one of the missing child incident kids, namely Susie. He tells her that her recently run-over dog isn't dead, he's just in a back room, and he'll show her, luring her into the back room to kill her and stuff her into Chica. We see the aftermath of him killing Charlotte Emily in Take Cake to the Children, but this is a more realistic showing of a dead Charlotte in an alleyway. But note the tire tracks and rain here, because this, I think, is enough evidence to argue that Midnight Motorist is also showing us William Afton. Now, some people argue this guy isn't William Afton because he is not purple. Fair. I would say that, if he was purple, it'd be impossible to see him on this screen but fair. Regardless, the fact that there's tire tracks leaving a raining scene of Charlotte Emily's death and the name of Midnight Motorist in the code is later that night is a strong enough connection to suggest that this is direct evidence of William Afton being the Midnight Motorist driver, driving back to his broken home. Now, who the guy on the couch and the runaway are, that's argumentative. I think it's Mrs. Afton and Michael Afton is the runaway, but that's speculation. Push it aside. FNAF World isn't super relevant to William Afton, but Ultimate Custom Night is, because it is basically explicitly stated that all of Ultimate Custom Night is just a forever purgatory torture hell for William Afton specifically. There are several voice lines directly stating that this guy, the guy dying in UCN, is the reason for all of this. He did this to other people, he created all of these animatronics, he's why we're here. That's gotta be William Afton. But if that's not good enough for you, there's a couple other points to it too. There's this Easter egg where you're in Old Man Consequence's lake, in the background you can hear this. And like, if one guy is yelling for help from Mike and Henry, well, the guy being tortured can't be Mike or Henry. It's gotta be William. Not to mention Old Man Consequences himself says, leave the demon to his demons. So we're talking about a bad guy here. William Afton is near definitively the player character in Ultimate Custom Night. But then, what about the games after that? After all, he dies in FNAF 6 and is in a forever purgatory in Ultimate Custom Night. So what about Glitch Trap and Help Wanted and Security Breach, Help Wanted 2 and all that? That gets tricky. This gets speculative. Because here's the thing. There is good argumentation for Glitch Trap to be in some ways possessed by William Afton. But I don't think there's good argumentation for that to happen before Glitch Trap is created. Because here's the conundrum. In Security Breach, we learned that Vanny, under the control of Glitch Trap, used Glamrock Freddy to dig under the Pizzaplex and uncover the FNAF 6 pizzeria underneath the Security Breach Pizzaplex. And in there, they find a burnt corpse that looks a lot like a burnt version of Scrap Trap from FNAF 6, a post-fire Scrap Trap, aptly named Burn Trap. Some people argue it's not William Afton, but guys. And the thing that holds me up about this whole process, if Glitch Trap was possessed by William Afton in some way, we've created a paradox. Because Glitch Trap is the one that uncovers William Afton's body. But if William Afton was already possessing Glitch Trap, how would he uncover himself? Because Glitch Trap was formed when they scanned in old technology that they scooped up and didn't let the company hold on to. Now, before Secret of the Mimic, we all were pretty certain it was something to do with William Afton, but now that we know of the Mimic's existence and the fact that there's old technology that houses the Mimic blueprints on it, it seems way more likely that Glitch Trap is just a manifestation of the Mimic, and then the Mimic was the one to go down and dig up William Afton. That seems like it makes a lot more sense. So I would argue that Glitch Trap is the Mimic mimicking William Afton. After all, they put a program that recreates everything it sees with the knowledge it already has, which would likely be of William Afton, which we'll get into a game that is comprised of nothing but the worst crimes William Afton ever did. So the idea that it wants to recreate those makes a lot of sense. That being said, there's no direct lore of William Afton in Help Wanted for that reason. Whereas in Security Breach, he's back, kinda, as Burn Trap. He exits a charging pod and gets scooped up by the blob in a non-canon ending. But the fact that this ending could happen, I think implies that Burn Trap is at least down there. And according to Gregory's drawings that perfectly recreate these scenes, maybe this did happen at some point. It's hard to say. Help Wanted 2, like Help Wanted 1, is similarly not very helpful for William Afton. This game is more so in the Mimic timeline of things, but it is worthwhile to note that Glitch Trap is here as well. And at this point in the timeline, Glitch Trap could be possessed by William Afton. After all, he's been unearthed at this point, so there's a possibility there. I don't think it's likely though. And finally, Secret of the Mimic, which we learn actually a lot about William Afton and his business practices. Essentially, Fazbear Entertainment and Murray's Costume Manor had a relationship that went back way into the 70s, to the point where Edwin's father knew about them and said not to trust them. So they go way back. But once Murray's Costume Manor started going under, William Afton saw an opportunity, and he gave them a contract that would have fixed all of their financial problems, but it was incredibly work intensive, and anytime Murray's Costume Manor got close, he'd change the contract, or have them redo something, wasting their time and wasting what little money they had left. All the while, as the company is crumbling, William Afton was working with an insider to get all the contact information for every employee in Murray's Costume Manor and personally reach out to them with better jobs, poaching their employees. So he was actively carving into this company, destroying it from the inside, and once it was just on the brink, William Afton sends this letter, which essentially says, "Hey, I know your business is failing, but don't worry. We'll buy everything and you can work for me instead, and you can even still live in your house. But I'll own it. You can live in it, but I'll own it." Which is crazy. So even before he's a child murderer, he was still an evil, greedy capitalist, otherwise known as a capitalist. Yes, I've made that joke before. I'm gonna make it every time. It's funny. But besides William Afton being a seedy businessman, we also know that he knows about the Mimic. The whole reason the game Secret of the Mimic exists is because Fazbear is sending technicians to retrieve the Mimic endoskeleton, which implies that Fazbear knows about it and wants it. So we can assume that eventually they get it, right? By the end of Secret of the Mimic is off somewhere. It's either wandering into the woods, having a fun party in the basement, or asleep in a non-canon ending. But we know that by Security Breach, the Mimic is trapped in the FNAF 6 underground bunker. So at some point they captured it, not to mention things like the Mexis console and the Fiona console being completely out of nowhere. So clearly William Afton got his hands on this technology at some point. We're just not sure when or what he did with it. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, we get a lot of what we know about William Afton in the Silver Eyes novel trilogy. But to be clear, these books are a completely separate story than what we see in-game. They barely line up at all. Some of the names still match, but even then, it's not great. It is essentially an alternate universe telling of the FNAF storyline. I like to think of it as a shared universe. Essentially, the laws of the universe are the same, and some of the people in them are the same people, but completely different events unfolded. That being said, it is worthwhile to bring up that in the Silver Eyes, William Afton does the missing child incident, and then leaves town and uses a fake name to come back to lay low and avoid being imprisoned, and he remains nearby the Freddy's location trying to find it. In the continuity of the Silver Eyes, they basically build a mall on top and around Freddy's and just like hide it in a back room somewhere, which is crazy, but whatever. But throughout the trilogy, we learn that William Afton's main motivations are seeking immortality and trying to become a perfect being, more than William Afton was, more than Springtrap is alone, some immortal thing. He's also obsessed with Henry Emily. William Afton kept a journal in the books, and they describe his writings of Henry as constantly flipping between insane adoration and intense hatred. So he had feelings. We love a little bit of toxic old man Yowie. But the Silver Eyes aren't the only books that we get lore about William Afton in. Then in comes Fazbear Frights. And I want to preface this by saying I think it's incredibly unlikely that these stories take place in the game's timeline, much like the novel trilogy, but I do think they're useful to talk about, because there's a story pretty much exactly about William Afton, and that's The Man in Room 1280. That story is an alternate version of the aftermath of FNAF 6. Essentially, paramedics rescued a corpse from a burning building. But corpse isn't exactly correct, because the man is somehow alive. His body is so burnt it's mostly translucent, and he should be dead. In fact, at some points they try to put him out of his misery, but whenever somebody tries to kill him, a strange ghost of a boy prevents them from doing so. In fact, when they scan his brain, there seems to be two consciousnesses inside of it. It's not until a priest seems to get through to William Afton enough to understand he wants to go to a Fazbear distribution warehouse that once he's there, William Afton just explodes into agony onto a bunch of artifacts, like FNAF merchandise and random old animatronic parts. And that's what causes all the epilogues of Fazbear Frights, and several of the stories themselves. Pretty much most of the haunted objects are explained by William Afton's agony infusing into something. and those objects are not only the main antagonists of most of the Fazbear Fright stories, but they are what's collected during the epilogues. So why am I bringing this up? Because, again, I don't think this could happen in the game's timeline. In the FNAF 6 bunker, William Afton is burnt alive within the Springtrap suit. First of all, his body is intertwined with it, and then it's further burnt. In the story of the Man in Room 1280, there is no animatronic suit on the man. So either paramedics get to the scene and the suit fully melted off, or while at the scene, they unintertwined his body with the suit and then pulled him out. Both of which are just a little too far for belief. Not to mention that in the games, we see a burnt corpse that looks a lot like William Afton in the last place we saw William Afton get burnt. Sometimes a spade is a spade, but I bring this up because it gives us good insight to how Ultimate Custom Night might have worked, because this is basically the book's version of Ultimate Custom Night. Now that's all the book lore, but we're not done. There's one more thing I should bring up. I mentioned earlier that Circus Baby's Pizza World existed, but I didn't mention how we knew. Well, one of the teasers in the lead up to Sister Location showed this graphic if you brightened the image. It's a newspaper clipping saying that Circus Baby's Pizza World was going to open, but the day before opening closed due to gas leaks and the entire project was abandoned. It seems fairly logical that this was actually because Circus Baby killed Elizabeth Afton, but it's notable that this is showing us a whole restaurant was planned, not just the party and rental. So that's all the direct lore about William Afton. And yeah, it's a lot. So when we talk about speculation, what speculative evidence do we have of William Afton? Well, this is what's tricky about this. William Afton specifically is tricky to fit into this format, because most of what we know definitively about William Afton is his actions. What he does, the things he actively caused. Most speculation about William Afton involves the why, his motivations. Like, for example, we know he did the missing child incident. We know he killed 5 children in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and stuffed them into animatronic suits. But it is never once explained to us why he did that. Never is it even closely stated as to why he did that. It gets a little bit in the books, but as far as the games go, not once is it said why he does that. Mainly because in the games, we never really get characterization of William Afton. We never meet the guy. He's not in the game. He's in effect a cause, a miasma around the games. It's because FNAF is sort of this like true crime adjacent series, right? Like the story of Five Nights at Freddy's isn't the plot. We're not surviving the missing child incident, we're learning about it because of what happened because of it. So we don't get to know a lot about William Afton, the guy. I think that's part of the reason why the fandom latched so strongly onto the Talbert files, something that, on the surface, frankly, seemed fake immediately. Arguably, obviously fake. But a lot of people wanted to believe this, not only because it was cool that we found a new thing, but because it gave us characterization of William Afton, something we've never had before, something that most of this fandom desperately craves for good reason. But, you know, that was fake, so we gotta figure it out ourselves. So what speculation is there about William Afton's motivations? So let's start with the quick and boring one. William Afton doesn't have a personal motivation. He just likes killing people, and he stumbled into the whole possession immortality thing. For whatever reason, there is a decent chunk of the fandom that anytime you bring up William Afton's motivations, go, not every villain has to have a tragic backstory. Sometimes people are just evil. Are you trying to justify child murder? Look, William Afton is evil, but even evil people justify their own actions in their own brain. In a franchise so filled with lore, and with every character having such tragic and deep inside personal reasons for the things they do, why would you want the main antagonist to be evil for evil's sake, and have no reason behind his murders besides the fact that he likes killing people? That's insane to me. That the fact that, like, Henry Emily is doing this entire FNAF 6 scheme because of a deep ridden guilt that he feels partially responsible for William Afton's crimes and is solving it doing the only thing he does best. but William Afton likes killing. You know, that's boring, and frankly, I can't argue against it. You're not giving me anything to disprove, because you're not giving me anything. So if you want to just sit there and say, sure, William Afton's evil, I'm not judging you, but I'm going to do the more personally fun thing and try to psychoanalyze this character to give a reason for why he does these things. So, let's go for the longest running theory, I believe, for William Afton's motivations. Trying to fix his child, the crying child. Or rather, in his words, put him back together. If the death of the crying child happens before the missing child incident in your timeline, then we know that it ends with William Afton vowing to put him back together. So it's pretty easy to contextualize everything he does after this as stemming from this promise. The missing child incident, the sister location remnant experiments, all of these were attempts to learn more about what happened to the crying child and see if he can recreate it in a way to induce possession. Prove that possession is possible, because if possession is possible, all he would have to do is build a lifelike animatronic of his son and have his son possess it. In essence, bringing him back to life, and he would fulfill that promise of putting him back together. And then, somewhere along the way, he fully loses his mind and is solely focused on the process of immortality, no matter who he's talking about. Mainly for himself. He wants to live forever. And I want to be very clear with my wording here. This interpretation does not imply that he actually loves his kids or was a good father. Every evidence we have shows William being a horrible, abusive father. But that being said, in his own mind, this still works and makes sense for a motivation. We can look from the outside and be like, oh yeah, he hates his kids and abuses them frequently. But in his mind, this is a problem he can solve. And if he can solve it, one that he can use for himself. He probably doesn't really care about losing the crying child. What really matters is the potential to possibly bring him back. Imagine being the man who solved death. Now, as common of an interpretation as this is, there are some admitted problems with it. If the crying child is the first death in the franchise, why does the sister location bunker exist? If the plush bear walkie-talkie is actually William Afton talking to the crying child from the sister location bunker, well then why does the bunker exist before he's doing any experimentation? Theoretically, William Afton would be down in the bunker with the Funtime animatronics and the remnant extracting scooper and all of this technology before needing to create it. Why he down there? Why he down there when no remnant? There are ways to work around this, but it's a question that's never had a satisfying answer for me personally. Until Secret of the Mimic, it's damn near certain that William Afton obtains F10N4, Fiona, and the Mimic post Secret of the Mimic. So the question is, what does he do with them? And what does he learn with them? Well, if he met Fiona, his obsession with immortality may have started way earlier than any of us have believed. Because here he is, finding somebody who, as far as he's aware, was perfectly recreated in artificial intelligence. Again, we know that F10N4 is nothing like actual real-life Fiona, but it's William Afton we're talking about. He's not really nuanced with personalities of people he barely talked to. But in essence, he's seeing the consciousness of a dead person artificially continuing. Pair this with the idea of an endoskeleton right in front of him that can recreate any person it knows about, and he's got fodder for experimentations for years. If he can figure out what makes these things tick, in essence, William Afton could live forever, even if he dies. Not to mention that Secret of the Mimic implies that the sister location bunker wasn't built by William Afton, but instead when he bought this land, he inherited that underground space and simply renovated it into the sister location we know of, which would give a reason for the bunker to exist before needing to necessarily do immortality experiments. It's sort of a yes and to the previous theory. Yes, William Afton started pursuing immortality after the death of the crying child, and he was already interested in it, learning what he did from Murray's costume manor, trying to extend life by having his dead son possess an artificial recreation of him to make the perfect continuation of life, and again, eventually losing his mind and trying to do it to himself instead. It's a theory I'm fairly partial to. It feels like a culmination of all these things we've already been thinking being given support by the franchise itself. But to be clear, again, all of that is speculation. We have no evidence as to what William Afton does with the Mimic. We just know it's very likely he gets his hands on them. So, with the tangible evidence and the speculative evidence of William Afton all out of the way, what does a character timeline for William Afton look like? Wait, how long is the video already? Oh, yeah. No. So here's the thing. Making a character timeline for William Afton is essentially just making a FNAF timeline, right? Like, all the things in this game so far happened because William Afton did some shit. So not only would that be a 30-minute to an hour-long process, and we're already this far into the video, at that point I might as well just make a full FNAF timeline, which I'm working on in the background. So I think it makes more sense to just call it here. This is the William Afton character study. This is what we knew about him definitively, and what we think about him because of what we know about him.